Have you ever set too few places at table or poured out too few drinks because I'm a person? Well, what is a person? Here is a person. A person is originally an actor's mask, whether for an ordinary dramatic performance or a ritual performance. And in the Greco-Roman world, these masks were called persona. They make fools of ourselves. When something goes wrong is when we act out of role. In other words, my role at the moment is being a speaker on television and talking to you. And I would be considered to flub the show if suddenly I acted out of role and did something that simply speakers don't do. And if I did this unintentionally, you become, insensitive. It doesn't mean that you go beyond human emotions, that you're no longer ever afraid, no longer sad, no longer loving other people because you see it's all one, so it doesn't make any difference. It's not like that. In Buddhism, they say, our object is not to make stone Buddhas, but living Buddhas. A stone Buddha is a symbol of what we might call an ultra-stoic, a person who so represses his fears and his emotions that he doesn't have any left. And they say, well, if that's your idea of a sage, a rock will do just as well. It doesn't mean that. It means rather that you're no longer afraid of being afraid. You're no longer afraid of grief, of pain, of being sensitive. You're no longer afraid, in other words, to go into life with total zest. In other words, when we say you're not fazed by anything, it means you don't block. Blocking, you know, is always difficult to overcome. It's just about the time of year when we have to do a lot of figuring, say, to work out our income tax. Don't you notice sometimes when you're adding columns of figures that there are certain combinations, like maybe 9 and 7 or something like that, at which you block? And this annoys you. Every time you reach this combination, you think, oh, yes, 9 and 7 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 9. Yes, 13. And you block. 9 and 7 aren't 13 anyways. I have often puzzled and puzzled about what it must be like to go to sleep and never wake up, to be simply not there forever and ever. After all, one has some intimation of this by the interval that separates going to sleep from waking. When we don't have any dreams but go to sleep, and then suddenly we're there again, and in the interim there was nothing. And if there was never any end to that interval, if the waking up didn't happen, that's such a curious thought. And yet, you know, I believe that although that's rather gloomy kind of consideration, I found that's one of the most creative thoughts I ever thought in my life. And I keep going back to it. You know, it's in line with a lot of the very fundamental questions that children ask. When they say, "Mummy, who would I have been if you had married someone else?" These are the kind of questions that make us puzzle profoundly about our existence. And one of the reasons why I think thinking about not being, about total non-existence, is so creative, is that in comparison with that thought, the fact that we are seems kind of queer, incredibly odd. But you know, in the Western world, I suppose we have two dominant ideas about what happens to us when we die. There's the old-fashioned idea that after we die, we go to another world. I say old-fashioned, not to say it's out of date. We don't know what the answer to this is. But that's the traditional answer of the Western world. When you die, you go to another life. Maybe heaven, maybe purgatory, maybe hell, who knows? I think nowadays, though, the more general idea, the more plausible idea to many people, is that when we die, we just cease to be. That's all there is to it. But we're inclined, I think, to have in our minds a picture of this, which indeed is depressing, of being shut up in the dark for always and always and always, to be kind of buried alive in a blackness where we are blind, deaf, and dumb, but somehow still conscious. But in the Eastern world, there are different ideas of this. The major Eastern idea is what is generally known as reincarnation, of going through life after life after life in an endless series, a process that is represented in this Japanese print of the Wheel of Life, the Buddhist Wheel of Life. This painting was lent to me by Mr. and Mrs. Imamura of Berkeley in California. He used to be the priest of the Berkeley Buddhist Church. And it shows the wheel of stages of existence through which beings pass, clutched by the great demon of impermanence. This is rather an unusual representation of the Wheel of Life. Perhaps some of you have seen these before. They usually have 6 divisions in the central part of the wheel here, and this one happens to have 5, and it's the Chinese-Japanese version of the Buddhist Wheel of Life, whereas I think prints in books, I know there was one some years ago in Life magazine, usually show the Tibetan version. But what we have here, and I think what I'll do, is I'll explain to begin with the popular interpretation of it, and then go on to see what more philosophical Buddhists think of it in a deeper way. These then are the 5 or sometimes 6 realms of existence through which, as I said, beings pass through their various lives. We could start here, for example. This is the human world. And then next to this is the world of the Devas, D-E-V-A, which we would translate into English as angel. Then this is the world of the animals. This is the world that is sometimes called the hells, only that's not quite a correct term for it. It should be called the world of the purgatories, because in this scheme of the universe, there is no everlasting state. There is no everlasting heaven and there is no everlasting hell. The demon of impermanence clutches the whole thing, and they all terminate. Next to the hells, there is the realm of what are called pretas, P-R-E-T-A. They are frustrated spirits, sometimes shown with very large stomachs and very tiny mouths, enormous appetite, but very small means of satisfying it. And the idea is, you see, that in the course of his development, the individual goes through life after life. If he does well, he ascends towards the heavens. If he does ill, he descends to the hells. Or he may fall from the human state to the animal state, or fall from the human state to the state of the ghosts. But the point that has to be remembered in the Buddhist idea of transmigration or reincarnation is that you can never stop anywhere. You may ascend to heaven, but what goes up must eventually come down. You may descend to hell, but what goes down must eventually come up. And so one goes on and on, moving through these various worlds until, in Buddhist ideas, you become sufficiently awakened to become a Buddha, one who is released from the wheel, and who does not fall anymore into the sequence of rebirths, but enters the eternal state of nirvana. Now, if you will look closer again, you will see that there are a number of figures round the outside of the wheel. And these represent what is called the 12-fold chain of dependent origination. That is to say, they are a series of links which form what might be called the sequence of life. They are, as it were, a schematic diagram of the force or the process that keeps this wheel rotating. And the chain starts with a demon down at the bottom here, who represents ignorance, or perhaps unconsciousness, the state of not knowing. Then next in order, you'll see a potter's wheel, and this represents potentialities of life. Next comes a monkey, who represents consciousness. A man in a boat. For some reason, this represents the combination of name and form. Words bringing out shapes. Words identifying shapes and things in the world. Here comes sense consciousness, the five senses, a man's body with the senses exposed. And here comes contact, a pair of lovers. After this, there comes perception. I am not quite sure what the symbol in this wheel is. It seems to show a man with a sword behind a screen and two women playing in front of the screen. The usual symbol you find here for perception is a man with an arrow in his eye, showing the pain involved in the perception of the world. The next in the link is desire. It shows a woman with twins. The next one here is called grasping, and that shows a man with a basket into which he is trying to get the fruits of life. And then as we come over round the wheel, we get a figure which means growth. I think this is one of the gods of prosperity, but it means growth, the fullness of life. Here is birth, a woman in parturition. Here is old age. And then, although the final stage of the links of dependent origination, as they are usually drawn, shows this one as the last and calls it old age and death, in this particular wheel they've been spread out so that you get old age, grief. No, excuse me, this is sickness. Old age, sickness, death, grief, compassion, suffering, and again back into ignorance. Here's another figure of ignorance, the camel being led by a blind man. Now, what I want you to notice particularly about this is that the chain represents what is called in Sanskrit the process of karma. I'm going to write that word because it's very fundamental to an understanding of this whole problem. Karma is sometimes understood, and maybe your ordinary dictionaries give it to you, as the law of cause and effect, but actually it comes from the root kri, which in Sanskrit means to act or to do. And the basic idea of karma is that it is action which always involves the necessity for other action. As the Buddha once expressed it, this arises, that becomes. Now, this isn't quite the same thing as cause and effect. It is rather the idea of linkage. For example, when I pick up this brush, I lift it by one end, and the other end comes up. Now we could say this is cause and effect, although this would be a rather cumbersome way of thinking about it. I could say, for example, that the coming up of the brush at this end is the effect of the cause, my lifting it at this end. But we don't ordinarily think so complicatedly about it. We think in a simpler fashion, namely, that to pick up this end is also to lift up that end because it's all one. So in the same way, Buddhists and Hindus who follow the idea of karma believe that life and death involve each other in the same way that the two ends of the brush, lifting up one involves lifting up the other. So in this way, living involves dying. We wouldn't say that the cause of death is birth, but birth and death go together and they are inseparable. And so if we will look again for a moment at the wheel, we can see that there are these important phases of it altogether. Here it ends with the sequence of pictures representing death and suffering and its attendant grief, ending in the blind man leading the camel and the demon, which together represent ignorance or unconsciousness. But once again here we have the potentiality of life, and then the monkey representing consciousness. All these things are looked upon as linked and therefore inseparable. And thus you see, we don't look upon ignorance as the first step or the first link in the chain from a chronological point of view. We only start numbering the chain, the steps of the chain here, because one has to begin somewhere when one's talking. And so the basic idea of this link is interrelatedness, interlockedness, so that death and life, as I said, imply each other. So that you might, speaking from the standpoint of Indian philosophy, of Hinduism, of Buddhism, you might pick an argument with Hamlet and say, to be or not to be is not the question. These are not alternatives. They are things that go together just like up and down, back and front, solid and space. Now there's another aspect to karma which needs to be considered here, and that is that karma also involves the idea of the continuity of pattern. You know, strictly speaking, Buddhists don't believe that there is any soul entity which passes from one life to another. There is no sort of fixed I or fixed ego which once was an animal and then became a man and then became an angel and then eventually became a Buddha or something like that. The idea of karma as the linking factor between the various lives is what we might call continuity of pattern. For example, consider an army regiment. A certain regiment goes on year after year after year. Old European regiments, for example, have existed for hundreds of years. And yet the personnel of those regiments and even the barracks in which they are stationed are entirely changed. In the same way, a university. Harvard University has existed for a long time. Oxford for a lot longer. And yet there is not a single member of the faculty, not a single student who was there when it first began. And yet, you see, the university goes on. Because what goes on is a pattern, a form of life. In the same way, the individual body of man, every 7 years, I think, all the molecules composing our physical structure are entirely changed. And yet, something identifiable as the pattern which we associate with Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so is still there. Another fascinating illustration of continuity of pattern in this sense is wave motion. It's perhaps easiest to illustrate with something like a barber's pole. When you twirl it. Now, as you twirl it, there's an illusion of something moving upwards from the bottom to the top of the pole. It seems that the strips go along. Now, actually, they don't go along. They just go round. And in the same way, also, when waves move across water, there's no water moving across. There is the wave pattern moving across. The water is just going up and down, as you can tell when you see, say, a dead leaf floating on the water's surface, and it isn't moved along by the waves. So this idea of continuity of pattern is the solution which Indian philosophy offers on the matter of the problem of death. The individual, as it were, entity is constantly changing. He does not go on, but the pattern, or the karma, the pattern of action goes on. And it's all embraced by that figure you saw of the great demon of impermanence. Could we look at that demon once again? I want to say something more about it. From our Western ideas, this fellow looks pretty evil. And we might associate him with the devil in the Hebrew or Christian sense of a principle of evil. In Buddhism, demons are not evil. They are really beneficent. They have a frightening aspect, but underneath this, there is a deeper meaning. This demon represents change or impermanence. But the deep insight underlying this is that change is a liberating factor. Death is a liberating factor. Did it not exist, life would not exist either. And therefore the wise man is not afraid of the demon. He goes, as it were, straight forward to him to embrace it. And at that moment, the demon is transformed. So in the same way, in a deeper sense, Buddhists do not think of these various realms of the wheel as literal worlds where there are angels and demons and starved ghosts. But they represent the various phases of consciousness. Equanimity, general kind of medium consciousness, quiet consciousness is the human state. The angel state is supreme happiness. The animal state is animality. Here is misery in its extreme, and here is frustration in its extreme. But the fundamental idea of the whole wheel that we have to remember, the idea of karma, is the interlocking, the interdependence of being and not being, of death and life, and the fact that the demon of change is really a disguise of the very source of life. The death without which life is impossible. The change without which life is totally boring. Now, of course, when any idea like that is explained, the first thing that we ask is it true? Is there a process of rebirth? Do our patterns go on and have influence to an illimitable future? But you know, as this idea is held by deeply thoughtful Hindus and Buddhists, it isn't a belief in something which we can't prove. It's really quite a self-evident notion. Think of it in this way. Supposing I make two statements. Statement one: after I die, I shall be reborn again as a baby, but I shall forget my former life. Statement two: after I die, a baby will be born. Now, I believe that those two statements are saying exactly the same thing. And we know that the second one is true. Babies are always being born. Conscious beings of all kinds are constantly coming into existence after others die. But why would I think that the two statements are really the same statement? Because after all, if you die and your memory comes to an end, and you forget who you were, being reborn again is exactly the equivalent of somebody else being born, because we have no consciousness of our continuity unless we have memory. If the memory goes, then we might just as well be somebody else. But it seems to me that the fascinating thing about this is that although a particular set of memories vanishes, death is not the end of consciousness. In other words, we are deluded by a kind of fantasy if we think of death as endless darkness. Endless nothingness is not only inconceivable, but it's logically absolutely meaningless, because we aren't able to have any idea, much less sensation of nothing, unless it can be compared with a sensation of something. These two things go together. And therefore, I think what is meant is that the vacuum created by the disappearance of a being, by the disappearance of his memory system, is simply filled by another being who is I, just as you feel you are I. The funny thing, though, about being I, about feeling that one is sort of a center of the universe, is that you can only experience this I sensation in the singular. You can't experience being two or three I's all at the same time. Now then, it seems to me that this idea has three very important consequences. One is that the disappearance of our memory in death is not really something to be regretted. Of course, everybody wishes to hold forever to the memories and to the people and the situations that he particularly loves. But surely, if we think this through, is that what we actually want? Do we really want to have those we love, however greatly we love them, for always and always and always and always? Isn't it inconceivable that even in a very distant future, we wouldn't get tired of it? And this indeed is the secret of the thing. This is why the demon of impermanence is beneficent. Because it is forgetting about things that renews their wonder. Just think, when you opened your eyes on the world for the first time as a child, how brilliant colors were. What a jewel the sun was. What marvels the stars. How incredibly alive the trees were. That's all because they were new to your eyes. Or in the same way, you know how it is, you've been reading a mystery story. And you're looking around the house, want something to read, you pick up an old mystery story. If you read it years and years ago and you've forgotten all about the plot, it still excites you. But if you remember the plot, it doesn't excite you. And so, by the dispensation of forgetting, the world is constantly renewed. And we are able to see it again and again, and to love again and again, to have people to whom we are deeply attached and deeply fond, always with renewed intensity, and without the contrast of having seen them before, always. Another consequence of this is a very curious realization. Remember that question, who would I be if my mother had married someone else? Who? If I were you, we often say. One might so easily have been you. I might so easily have been born in China and India. Why do I feel that the world is centered in this place, as distinct from some other place? You jolly well know the world is centered where you are. And this gives one a very strange feeling of the idea that other people jolly well exist in the same sense you do. Everybody's name is I. That's what you call yourself. So there will always be I's in the world. Every I is in a way the same I. We all might be anyone else. And there is no escape It goes on and on and on and on. So long as there is consciousness anywhere, there is I. You then, in a way, look out through all eyes. And that, perhaps, is the secret of the great virtue of compassion. I'm going to show you an ancient Chinese method of divination. Perhaps you know that divination is really a kind of fortune-telling. But this particular kind of divination is based on what some people believe to be the very oldest of all the Chinese classics, the Book of Changes. I say divination is something like fortune-telling, but it's a little bit more highbrow than ordinary fortune-telling. One wouldn't, I think, presume to ask so hoary a book of wisdom as the I Ching what to bet on the stock market. Rather, one asks questions about one's spiritual, psychological state, or very great momentous decisions of life. The very old and orthodox way of consulting the Book of Changes is to use the stalks of the yarrow plant. A number of stalks are taken and divided at random, and so calculations are made. This is a rather long and elaborate way of doing it, and a not so ancient but equally respectable way is to use Chinese coins. You know, the kind of coins that have a hole through the middle, and so that you can carry them on a string round your neck. So if I would ask the Book of Changes, what is the best thing for me in my present state? That is the sort of question that would be appropriate under circumstances like this. So we take the coins, and we shake them, and drop them. And according to the way they fall, heads or tails, we get a positive or a negative reading. In this particular case, we get a negative reading. The symbol which records the negative reading being the drawing of a broken line. That line is called a yin, or negative line. We do it again. And this time the reading is again negative. And we record it. We shake them again. And this time the reading is positive. And we record that by an unbroken line, or a yang line. Y-A-N-G, representing the positive principle. Again, and once more the line is negative. Again, and the line is once more negative. And then a final sixth time, and the line is positive. And so we get this figure. And in order to know what it means, we have to take a look at a very, very ancient diagram which may be familiar to you. Perhaps you've seen this diagram on Chinese bowls, or jewelry sometimes, or carving in jade. This is called Pa Gua, or the 8 trigrams. In the center of the design, you see this figure, which may be familiar to some of you as the trademark of the Northern Pacific Railroad. But actually, its meaning in China is the symbol of these two fundamental principles, the negative and the positive, the yang and the yin, which are held to lie at the root of all phenomena in the world. The word yang, which is represented by this comma or fish that is white, means the south or bright side of a mountain. And then yin, Y-I-N, we romanize that, means the shady or dark side of a mountain. And thus, respectively, they're called the male and the female principles. Now, you will obviously notice that with the symbolism of a light and dark side of a mountain, that you can't have a mountain with only one side. The two sides must always go together. And so in the same way, the Chinese feel that the positive and the negative, the light and the dark, the male and the female, the auspicious and the inauspicious, always go together in human life because one cannot be distinguished without the other. In the second chapter of his book, the old philosopher Lao Tzu, whom I've mentioned many times in these programs, says, when all the world recognizes beauty to be beautiful, there is already ugliness. When all the world recognizes good to be good, there is already evil. Thus, to be and not to be arise mutually. And you can say that to be is the principle yang and not to be the principle yin, respectively the positive and the negative. And now outside the rotating figure of the positive and negative principles, you will find these 8 trigrams. Trigrams meaning symbols of 3 lines. And here you will see the broken and the unbroken lines, such as I drew when I was consulting the oracle. The broken being the yin lines and the unbroken, the yang or positive lines. And these trigrams represent the 8 fundamental principles or elements which, according to this book of changes, are involved in every life situation. For example, the one at the top means heaven or sky, the one below means earth. This is the father, this is the mother. Over this side, for example, this one means fire, and over here, that one means water. And as you will see, we derived 2 of these trigrams, the point of the oracle being that every situation in life is a combination of 2 of these principles in preponderance. And the ones that we have here is this one repeated twice. And this one has the meaning of a mountain. A mountain over a mountain. Now there are 64 possible combinations of these 8 trigrams, which makes the meaning of each combination pretty difficult to remember. So we'd better go and look at the Book of Changes itself and see what it has to say about this particular one, what advice the oracle would want to give me in answer to my question about my present situation. The mountain over the mountain happens to be, let's see, that's number 52. The figure of the mountain, of course, it has a symbolism, and it means the idea of quietness or keeping still. And so when we have keeping still, quietness above quietness, we get a whole emblem whose meaning is profound calm. And so the oracle says, keeping still. Keeping his back still so that he no longer feels his body, he goes into his courtyard and does not see his people. No blame. Mountains standing close together, the image of keeping still. Thus the superior man does not permit his thoughts to go beyond his situation. The heart thinks constantly. This cannot be changed. But the movements of the heart, that is, a man's thoughts, should restrict themselves to the immediate situation. All thinking that goes beyond this only makes the heart sore. Now you can see that that's pretty generalized advice. And it's appropriate in a way to the question, because the question was vague and the answer was vague. But the symbolism of this answer is simply that sitting so as to keep one's back still so that one's back is not noticed is self-forgetfulness. And keeping one's thoughts to the immediate situation means the practice of meditation or calmness, quietness, and that's what I'm advised to do. It's good advice. Now you may say, well, this is a thoroughly crazy way of coming at decisions, especially if I were to ask something more specific than this. If I had asked, advice on some momentous decision I had to make, we would naturally say, from our modern scientific point of view, that flipping coins to come to the great decisions of life is the stupidest thing we could possibly do. After all, it neglects all rational cogitation about our situations. We would say, well, it takes no account of the data in the situation. It makes no intelligent assessment of the probabilities. And we, before we make any important decision, we think over all the factors involved. We balance the pros against the cons. We balance assets against deficit and so on. We go into the situation and think it out thoroughly. And therefore, what could be more superstitious than relying upon some oracle that has entirely to do with the purely chance falling of the coins that have no relation to the problem whatsoever? That's our contemporary point of view about all methods of fortune-telling, divination, and so on and so forth. But now look, someone who believed in this system, an old-fashioned Chinese, might say to us, but listen, first of all, when you estimate the data, when you consider the facts that are involved in any particular decision, how do you know exactly what facts are involved? After all, you're going to sign a contract, and the facts you think about that are relevant to this contract are the state of your own business, the state of the other fellow's business, the prospects, the market, and so on and so forth. But something that you may never have considered at all may enter into the situation and change it utterly. The man with whom you're going to make the contract may slip on a banana skin, and so hurt his head and become inefficient in business. How would anyone ever think of such an eventuality in taking a sane and rational view of the situation? Or he might say to us, how do you know when you've got in enough data? After all, the data, the causes, the problems involved in any particular situation are virtually infinite. And as a matter of fact, you stop getting in data, stop getting information as to how to solve a problem, either when you're tired of it, or when the time comes to act and you haven't time to collect any more data. And he would say that is just as irrational as flipping coins, because you decide when to stop investigating in a very arbitrary way. So are you really very much more ahead of us? Well, we would say, what about probabilities? After all, we rely a great deal upon statistics in order to make decisions. And he would say again about statistics. Yes, statistics are all very well when you want to know what a lot of people are going to do. For example, if you flip a coin, you know that if you flip a coin 100 times, there is going to be quite a probability that you will toss half of the time heads, half of the time tails. 1,000 tosses, and you will get nearer to an exact half and half. But each individual toss, the chance is 50-50 whether it will be heads or tails. In other words, you may have tossed 999 times, and you may have had 400 tails tosses. You may have had the rest heads tosses. So the probability will be on the thousandth that it will go to tails because that's had the lesser number of tosses. But actually, your chance on it coming up heads or tails at that particular moment is, again, 50-50. And the probability really tells you nothing. And so in the same way with the actuarial tables of insurance companies, they will say the average lifespan of an adult male is 65 years. But on any individual case, these tables do not tell us when I am going to die. And so our critic, our Chinese critic might say, well. So you see, I myself am of a somewhat skeptical temperament. And I very much doubt, in fact, whether this way of coming at decisions really worked. Or, let us put it this way, we can never really prove whether any method of coming to decisions really works. I mean, I may make a foolish decision, and I call it foolish because as a result of it I get killed. But there's absolutely no way of showing that my getting killed at that moment didn't preserve me from a worse fate, from making mistakes that involved the lives of many other people. if I so-called succeed by making a right decision and I earn $1 million, there's no way of showing that this isn't so bad for my character. That's the worst thing that could possibly happen. So we never really know whether the outcome of a decision is a failure or a success. Not in the long run, because only the unknown, what comes next, will show whether it was good or bad, and the unknown stretches infinitely into the future. But it seems to me that the importance of this old Chinese book of divination is twofold. First of all, there's a bad side to it, a distinct disadvantage in Chinese culture. The Chinese came so much to rely on the Book of Changes and to use its system of symbols, those trigrams I showed you, to use these for classifying all natural phenomena, that in the course of time it became a very rigid thing and it excluded the perception of novelty. Now the warning and the advantage to us of that is we can do the same thing with scientific method. There are certain kinds of personality who become very rigid in their scientific ideas and simply automatically exclude certain possibilities because they don't conform with alleged scientific dogma. Take, for example, what we call ESP, or extrasensory perception. I rather call it extraordinary sensory perception. Still, there is good reason to believe that there is extremely strong evidence for something of this kind occurring. And yet many scientific people will ignore that evidence because they say things like that simply can't happen. And that is to fall into the same rut that the Chinese fell into when they relied too meticulously upon the classification of the world and of events found in the Book of Changes. But there's a positive side to the picture. For this Book of Changes is founded on a view of life which is very suggestive to us, which is in accord with certain points of view that now develop in our own science. A way of life, a way of looking at life, which sees not so much the causal relationship between events as the pattern of events. Let me try and show that difference. When we think of causality, we think chiefly of the way events are determined by their past. It's as if events were a lot of marbles, and they're thrown together and they knock each other around. And therefore, in tracing the movement of any particular marble, we try to find out which other marbles knocked it, and so trace it back and back and back. And until quite recent times, the whole view of Western science was based on the idea of causality, how things are influenced by past things. But the point of view that underlies the Book of Changes, and the Chinese never really applied to their science, they applied it rather to their art and perhaps their philosophy of law. But the point of view here is different. It is instead of understanding events by relation to past causes, it understands events by relation to their present pattern. And in other words, it comprehends them by taking a total view instead of what we might call a linear view. If, for example, we can find a suitable analogy for the Western way of looking at things, we might say it is understanding events in accordance with the order of words. For example, I can say, this dog has no bark, and then, this tree has no bark. Now, the meaning of bark in these two sentences is determined by what went before them. I make sounds before I say the sound bark. Before I say bark, I say this dog has no. Now, if I want to know what bark means, I have to go back to what happened in the past. But if you take the order not of words, but what I would rather call the order of design, we get a rather different situation. Supposing I draw two small circles. And these correspond to the two words bark. They're both the same. But now, supposing a a design arises around those two circles. And then at once we see that in their context, those two original circles have quite different meaning. But you see their relationship to their meaning all at once. I mean, imagine, supposing these designs had not been drawn by a brush, line after line after line, but had appeared all together at once as you see the image appear when you're developing a photographic plate. Then you would see that the meaning of each part of the design is relative to the rest of it as you see it now at this moment. And so in the same way, the fundamental philosophy of the Book of Changes and of the Chinese idea of the relationship between events is to understand every event in its present context, not understanding it so much as we do by what went before it, but rather understanding it in terms of what goes with it. Thus, the idea of the Book of Changes is to reveal through its symbols the total pattern of the moment when the question is asked, on the supposition that the pattern of this moment governs even the tossing of the coins. Now then, the interesting comparison that arises out of this is that because we in the West have tended to understand events in accordance with the order of words, in accordance with the order of causality, we have evolved a conception of nature as based on law. In other words, when we ask for the explanation of any natural phenomenon, we look for that explanation in words, in a formulation that will describe a law. On the other hand, the Chinese have not evolved the idea of a law of nature, but something quite different, but equally valid and equally useful. There is indeed a word in Chinese for law, in very much our sense of law. It's a rather interesting word because as it was originally written, it was a picture like this. That's a picture of an iron cauldron, and beside it, a figure holding a knife. This is the Chinese word for law, T-S-E, Z, which most corresponds to our idea of law. And the reason for this symbol is that in ancient times, some of the old emperors commanded the laws to be written on the iron sacrificial cauldrons. And when the people came to offer sacrifice and put their offerings into the cauldrons, they could read the laws written upon the cauldrons. But at the time when those ancient emperors ordered the laws to be written in this way, there were certain sages and scholars who said, no, you shouldn't write the laws down, because if you write the laws down, the people will develop a litigious spirit. That is to say, they will start quibbling. And therefore, the property of the order of nature is sometimes called in Chinese not this. The expression wu zi, wu meaning not, wu zi is used, meaning apparently lawless. But it doesn't really mean lawless. For example, if we go for a moment to Chinese ideas of civil law, a good judge does not base his decisions on this kind of law, written down law, because he knows that no written law can apply to all the complex multiplicity of circumstances that may arise. And so he bases his decisions on what the Chinese call not law, but justice. This word is pronounced E-I. And justice in this sense corresponds rather to our idea of equity. It is the sensibility for order and reasonableness that is embodied in an individual. He hasn't got it clearly written down, but he is the sort of person who is able to judge in any particular circumstance whether a certain decision is fair or not fair. And they much rather trust a man who has E in him than a man who has a thorough knowledge of the rules. And so we come thus to a conception of the order of nature That is one of the most important words in the Chinese language, and that is a word which originally meant the markings in jade, the grain in wood, or the fiber in muscle, and it's pronounced li. This is a character then, meaning really the basic fundamental pattern of things. But such an image is used as the markings in jade or the grain in wood, because this is an extremely subtle, complex pattern, a huge area of events all happening together at once, which has to be taken in at a glance, in the same way as we take design in at a glance, understood at a glance, and therefore is not capable of formulation in the order of words. And so Li, meaning perhaps organic pattern, is the fundamental Chinese idea of the order of nature. In other words, when we think of beauty, we know very clearly what is beautiful and what isn't. But it's absolutely impossible to write down a set of laws and rules as to how one will create beautiful objects. In mathematics, for example, mathematicians often feel that certain equations, certain expressions are peculiarly beautiful. And mathematicians, because they are meticulous people, try to think out exactly why is this beautiful. Could we make up a rule for beauty? And yet they come to the conclusion that if we could make up a rule and apply it in mathematics, and always by the use of this rule get a beautiful result, eventually those results would cease to impress us as being beautiful. They would become sterile and dry. And so in the same way, the order of nature, the order of justice, the order of beauty are things which we can know in ourselves, but we cannot write down in black and white. And therefore, the superior man is one who has the sensibility for these things in himself.
In talking about Buddhism and science, I'm not going to try to prove that Buddhism is in some way scientific, but rather compare the two as different forms of knowledge. I think one has to be very careful of making claims for forms of ancient philosophy that some are more in accord with the spirit of science than others. For in so many ways, science is such a new thing in the world. And I often find that people who make claims for various religions or philosophies of the ancient world as being scientific actually don't know very much about science. So I think we should start in this sort of discussion asking, what is science? First of all, science is a method of description. If we have a form of this kind, a rather wiggly form, as I've sometimes said, the natural world is full of wiggly forms. And science, in dealing with the natural world, is an attempt to describe them exactly. If we describe this particular form poetically, as distinct from exactly, we might say, well, it's like a flame dancing above the fire, burning gas, or something of that kind. But the interest of science is to describe these forms very precisely indeed. And to do so, it employs a method which is fundamentally like this: to superimpose over the form some very simple, regular pattern in terms of which the form can be described. And what we see here is a system of squares which can be described accurately because they can be numbered up and down. And if we were, for example, to fill in the light gray area, the squares over which the form passes, we should get a rather rough but still approximate
formal equivalent of the original figure. But you notice in the top left-hand corner of the screen that where the squares are drawn much more finely, you get a greater approximation to the original figure. In other words, the whole method of scientific description is one of, shall we say, putting things in boxes. Basically, this is the act of classification, of representing the complex forms of the world in terms of simpler, regular forms that we can understand. Regular forms that we can count, measure, classify, and so on. And in this way, we get a well-controlled description of physical reality. So you could say that in a way, science is the art of definition, of getting things down, as we say, in black and white, of assimilating the unknown, the irregular, and the wayward to patterns that are known, regular, and controlled. And basically, this is really the whole operation of that distinctively human activity that we call thought. Because thought is fundamentally classification, and so also science is classification. If you read older works of science, works of, say, natural history and zoology, you will see that the primary concern of the scientist was to classify the various species of nature, the various types of butterflies and insects, the various forms of rocks, the various varieties of plants, and to get them all into classes, like animal, vegetable, mineral, and all their innumerable subdivisions. And so, thought fundamentally asks of classes, is a given natural phenomenon in that class, or is it not in it? The question is always, as we say slangily, is we is or is we ain't? And this method of classification is not only basic to thought, but in a way, it's basic to the operation of the human nervous system. For of each one of the neurons that compose our nervous system, it can be said that it has only two states, a state corresponding to yes and a state corresponding to no, like an electric current is either on or off. And in the same way that, for example, the television camera scans a given scene, such as my face, and sends impulses along a wire to the transmitter and then to your set. These impulses are fundamentally of a yes or no character. And the structure of the screen at which you are looking is something like that grid structure which I showed you a moment ago spread over the black flame. And it reinterprets the picture in terms of ever so many little units of on or off, yes or no. So in the same way, the great computer machines which scientists have built to give mechanical equivalents of the human mind use, in most cases, what we call binary arithmetic. That is to say, a number system in which there are simply two numbers, 1 and 2, corresponding approximately to the same duality of yes and no upon which all thought is based, and which is also the basis of classification. When we put, in other words, when we put phenomena into mental boxes, when we class them, the fundamental question is it in this box or is it not in this box? And this is the basic principle of science, which it elaborates in the most marvelously complex ways. And I think we might think about some of these more complex forms.
The scientist, as I said, does not simply consider the world in terms of such very simple patterns as the grid or the set of squares drawn over a form which he wants to describe accurately. To go to an opposite extreme, the task of the mathematician, who is fundamental to all science, is really to think up complex patterns. And the pure mathematician doesn't bother his head particularly as to whether the patterns in algebra or geometry or arithmetic with which he's concerned bear any resemblance to events in the real world. For example, we would say that in the real world, we live in a space, a physical space, in which there are only three dimensions. There's the dimension of height, of width, and then in perspective, we can represent the dimension of depth. And we feel that in the real world, in the physical space with which we're familiar, we can only have three right angles drawn about a point. The right angle between height and width, the right angle between depth and height, and the right angle between depth and width. But, of course, the mathematician can, in theory, think of an infinite number of right angles round this point in a kind of imaginary space that we cannot visualize with our senses. And he can say, for instance, that a line drawn this way is also at right angles to all the other dimensions, and go on and on and on, inventing an apparently fantastic space which has infinitely many dimensions. Now, it may so turn out that this speculation, this construction of a fantastic pattern, does have some actual application to nature. And the mathematical equations which are concerned with spaces of infinitely many dimensions are actually applicable to fluctuations in prices and things of that kind. But this was an entirely unexpected application. So the fundamental task of science is to invent patterns and see in applied science whether these patterns enable us to comprehend the behavior of the physical world. There's another sense in which patterns may be used to explain things. Supposing I draw such a figure as this. And ask the question, what is it? Now, there are various ways of explaining this figure and making what appears to be, at the moment, a sort of nonsensical abstraction, the very sort of thing we run across in the natural world, of making some sense of it. Now, supposing I say that is a drawing of a tree trunk with lopped off branches on it. This immediately, in your mind, makes sense of the picture because it has related it to something with which you're familiar. In another sense, it has classified it. It has given an intelligible pattern to these lines which I scratched out on the board. But supposing we offer another explanation of it and say, it's a bear climbing a tree. Of course, the bear is hidden behind the tree. This gives you an entirely different picture of the same original drawing. And so in the same way, when the scientist explains various natural phenomena, let's say we see a partial eclipse of the sun. Now, if you are a member of a culture which firmly believes that eclipses of the sun are the result of the sun being eaten up by a dragon, you will see something here corresponding to what you see in this drawing when you say, oh, it's a bear climbing a tree from behind. You will have in your mind's eye a highly complex and elaborate version of what's going on here, something in fact like this.
there will be the dragon eating up the sun. Now, you won't perhaps actually visualize that dragon in the same way that when I tell you that this is a bear climbing a tree, you will almost, see the bear behind it. You know, here he is. Almost in your mind's eye, you see that bear. And almost in your mind's eye, if you really believe that a partial eclipse of the sun is caused by a dragon, you will believe that you see the dragon. But on the other hand, if the scientist explains it more simply and says a partial eclipse of the sun is simply caused by the moon crossing the sun, you will have a simple picture like that in your mind's eye. So these are the ways in which the scientist is giving an account of the world. He is assimilating things that we don't know, patterns that we don't understand, to patterns that we do understand. And so the question arises further in exploring what is the function of science, to ask, why do we want to do that? Why do we want to be able to describe the world in terms and in patterns that we can understand? And surely the answer is that if we can interpret the unknown in terms of the known, if we can describe what is going on in the world in regular patterns, we can predict what things are going to do next. In other words, if a pattern is regular, it is regular not only in shape, say, it will also be regular in rhythm. We time the apparent rising of the sun, and we find that it rises daily in a regular rhythm. And so every new day, we feel we can bet on the sun following the same rhythm since it has done so for so long. And so then further, what is the point of predicting future events? Obviously, the point of predicting what is going to happen is that it enables us to control what is going to happen, to adapt our own actions accordingly, and therefore to establish what we call technical control over our physical environment. And in this way then, you could say that the purpose of science is to control both our own nature and physical nature in order that the human race may survive as comfortably as possible in its natural surroundings. And you will see that that involves, in other words, a constant superimposition of human ideas of order upon the apparent disorder which we first find when we look at the natural world. In other words, when a baby is born, or when a blind person first acquires the gift of sight through a surgical operation, what they see with their eyes is a chaos. A mature blind person who has never seen but is enabled to see by an operation, at first of all finds the experience of sight extremely confusing. He can't make any sense out of it at all. And he has to learn it. In other words, he has to interpret what he doesn't know, the objects of vision, in terms of what he does know, the sense of touch. He has to realize, for example, that the four corners of a table which he sees out there are related in a square pattern. And he has to understand how what he sees, the unknown, is related to what he has felt with his eyes closed through his fingertips, the known. And in this way, then, the whole task of applied science is, as it were, to assimilate the world of knowledge to the patterns of human order in rather the same way that when we eat, we assimilate dead bulls and dead vegetables and eggs and all that kind of thing. We absorb them in and we assimilate them to the physical organization of the human body. Knowledge is, in other words, a form of eating. Just for the two processes are equally of assimilation. And therefore, the extension of man's control over nature might metaphorically be described as a mental eating up of the universe. And as a result of this process, the organization of human life, its systems of communication and systems of control,
are extended more and more and more, in just the same way, for example, that by assimilating the minerals out of the soil and the rays out of the sunlight, a plant like a fern grows and grows and grows and extends its form. And in this way, its organization prevails. Now then, you see, if you take this task of what we call the conquest of nature, the task of making order victorious over chaos or randomness, if you take this seriously, you will look upon it as warfare. And you will firmly believe that the most urgent thing that there possibly can be is to make order prevail over randomness, to make good prevail over evil, to make life prevail over death. And we find that when we are in a contest of this kind, a serious warfare game of this kind, and we take it seriously, we are involved in it in a very deep and bitter sense. Now, the difference of Buddhism from science as a form of knowledge is that in Buddhism it would be said that this view of things, this view of the task of life as making order triumph over disorder, leaves something out. You remember right at the beginning I made some importance of a Sanskrit word which is fundamental in Buddhism, avidya. Avidya, which meant a means non, vidya knowing. Non-knowing or ignorance, or better, ignorance. Ignorance, in other words, leaving something out of account. And I want to use a familiar illustration to show in what way we ignore. You see here a figure which is apparently, as you look at it, two faces in profile about to kiss each other. Now, if we draw back a little from those two faces, we can see on the white area in between them the form of a cup. But the interesting thing about this is that as you look at it, you will either be able to see the form of the cup or the form of the two faces in profile, as it were, about to kiss each other. You can alternate them between them very rapidly, but you will not be able to see them both that way at the same time. In other words, either the white must be the background and the black the figure on the ground, or else the black must be the background and the white cup showing up on it. And so in this way, we are unable to see really, we can think it. After a while we can get accustomed to the idea that the figure and the ground, the black and the white, are mutually necessary to each other. In that figure that I showed you, you could say both the cup with the stem and the two faces are there. But our ideas about them, our concepts, are mutually exclusive, and we cannot see them both at the same time. And in the same way, in this figure that I drew, we either see the sawn-off stumps or the bear claws. It's difficult to see this figure both ways at the same time. And so, also, just as we see one and not the other, so we identify ourselves. After all, when you're looking at the white figure in that illustration, which is the cup, you, as it were, identify with the cup. When you look at the two faces, you identify with the profile. So in the same way, when we experience the world around us, we identify with the subject, the knower. We don't identify with what we see. But as a matter of fact, if there is nothing seen, there is no experience of a seer. If there is no seer, there is no experience of anything seen. They both go together in the same way as the black and the white. And this idea that the yes and the no, the black and the white, the inside of a class, say we draw a square as representing fundamentally the idea of class. I can't have a square which doesn't have both inside and outside. They go together. And in Buddhism, this going together is called shunya. Although this is often translated void, it means that the inside of the square cannot exist, is void without the outside, the subject without the object, the black without the white. This, of course, is represented in this fundamental Chinese figure of the yang, or the positive principle, and the yin, or the negative principle, like two fishes, constantly circulating, going round and round and round and round in the alternations of life. Now, the question is, are these two fishes involved in a fight? Is the white one eating up the black one, and the black one trying to eat up the white one? If that is the situation, then of course life is fundamentally nothing but a grim contest. If this one up here is the good fellow and this one is the bad fellow, if this is order and this is chaos, then a fight goes on between them. And that's largely the way in which our technology has interpreted man's situation as against nature. This is man, the white, the good fellow. This is nature, the dark, the bad fellow. And the white one has got to eat him up. But what happens if the white fish succeeds in eating up the dark fish? The white fish disappears as well as the dark one, because the white one is only there in relation to the dark. So then, if these two fishes, as it were, wake up, if this one wakes up and this one wakes up, which is called awakening in Buddhism, they realize they're one. In other words, they go together. They're inseparable from each other. And this realization is that experience, which is called in Zen Satori, or in Buddhism, Bodhi, awakening. This sudden dawning on our consciousness that life is not really a contest to make yes triumph over no, to make the positive triumph over the negative. The two sides go together. And then one sees, in this strange way, that underlying all that is negative in the world, all that is in a way painful and evil, there is a kind of necessity to it. It goes with the good. It is necessary for the good. Disorder is necessary for the manifestation of order, just as you must have, say, a black background to show up a light figure. And then when one sees that, a profound transformation takes place in one's attitude to the world. That is to say, instead of looking upon life as a contest, it becomes a dance, it becomes a game. One doesn't withdraw from it, one doesn't stop living, but one goes into the game so that these revolving fishes are no longer trying to eat each other, but they're just going around dancing, having the biggest fun in the world. So then, must we have fixed in our minds the idea that all the forms and patterns of nature are simply methods of attack or defense, that they're devices for camouflage, that they're simply lures for sexual attraction or other utilitarian purposes? Or can we see in them a dance, a joyous cosmology?
Throughout this series, I have been trying to explain two fundamentally different ways of looking at our world. One characteristic predominantly of the West and the other of the East. And these might be called, respectively, the way of description as opposed to the way of seeing. The way, in other words, of understanding things in words or in terms, contrasted with the way of understanding through looking and seeing a field or a subject totally all at once. Or you might call these the linear view, strung out in a line, or the total view, seeing all at once, or the serial view on the one hand, as contrasted with the simultaneous view on the other. Now, in classical Western science, we have depended largely on this serial or analytic view, which understands the world by translating it into ideas, into words, or into, say, even series of numbers. The basic feature of it being that things are understood in a step-by-step way in sequence. And insofar as we constantly look at nature in that way, we tend to think of nature as something constructed, something, in other words, made or put together as we ourselves make and put things together through a series of steps. And perhaps this gives us the feeling that if we understood nature sufficiently, if we understood in full detail all the steps which go to the making of our universe, we could ourselves make it. Now, it's here, you see, that we get a very fundamental contrast between East and West, and especially through Chinese and Japanese ideas of the formation of nature. Because for them, it seems extremely odd to think of nature as being constructed or made by a sort of step-by-step procedure. Their feeling is rather that the world and its forms are not so much constructed as grown. And one of the most important keys to an understanding of Far Eastern thought is to see the difference between a view of a constructed world and a grown world. Now, to give a sort of crazy illustration of this, supposing I construct something, for example, an artificial flower. And you know, when you get instructions how to do this, and you buy a book of do-it-yourself artificial flowers, you get a step-by-step procedure which tells you what to do. Step one, take a piece of wire with a black button and fix it to the end. Step two, take the stamens, previously cut out, and affix it to the button. Next step, insert a disc of sticky material, push the wire through the middle, and then affix the petals. Here they go, and notice that as I put them on, I take them from outside and around me, things that are bits, and I bring these bits together to make the flower, the construction, or whatever form it is that I'm intending to create. And so from going around to the center, from getting something that was previously pieces and bringing it all together, I get my flower. But now, watch how an actual flower grows. How it starts, as it were, from the center. And it unfolds itself, not bit by bit, but all the parts of the flower exfoliating together from the center outwards, in contrast to the making process which goes from the outside inwards. From a situation where the parts are originally all apart, all in bits, and then assembled. Contrasting with a situation where you have some simple beginning like a seed or a bud, and as it expands, it constellates or forms its own parts from within itself. And this is the fundamental process of natural growth. It's in the same way that the human baby is formed within the womb. It's in the same way that if you watch crystals under a microscope forming in a solution, you will notice the whole area of the crystal, the whole structure of the crystal coming into being all together at once, and you will not see a kind of bit-by-bit assemblage which we use when we make machines or make houses or make tools. Even when we carve a block of wood, although the block of wood is not originally a lot of distinct parts, nevertheless we work upon it from the outside towards the inside, whereas all processes of growth go from the inside to the outside. Now, in our current scientific way of thinking in the West, this kind of growth, this kind of formation, is always talked about in terms of what we call field theory, fields of force. And I suppose one of the most striking exhibitions of what a field is can be seen in looking at the formation of magnetic lines of force in iron filings, as when we take filings that are not magnetized, just thrown chaotically over an area, and then with the magnets underneath, notice that all the filings form together into a pattern. The whole area moving together, every single part of it simultaneously, into its shape. And that shows us the whole nature of a field of force. Now, the fascinating thing is that some of these fundamental words which we've been studying throughout this program for the basic principle of nature, or the basic reality underlying the world, are words that have the meaning of a field. Let's take, for example, the word I introduced to you some programs ago, a term used in Buddhism, shunya, which meant the void, the great space, as it were, underlying the whole world. This has in it the idea of a field, in the same way that basic Chinese word Dao also has the idea of a field of forces, an area in which everything happens. Or again, the Hindu word Brahman, although it doesn't literally mean a field, it's also often symbolized by the idea of a vast inclusive space. And the direct connection of this with the idea of a field comes out in another Buddhist word which describes the entire universe. This Sanskrit word, dharma, that means, well, law or function. Sometimes it means the Buddhist doctrine, sometimes it means a method, but you could say dharma in this particular context means the fundamental order of the world. And so the expression meaning universe is dharma dhatu. And this Sanskrit word dhatu is usually translated realm, but it has the idea of a field, especially when you see its Chinese equivalent, which is written this way. And here we have the character at the top actually means a field, and the bottom part of the character means a shellfish, but think of something like a clam with two shells, and giving one the idea of inclusion or enclosing in, the enclosed within a field. This is dharma dhatu. And then in turn, in the field there is a structure, and the structure of the field is thought of as governing the formation of the universe. And you may remember that in the last program I gave you a particular Chinese word which meant the basic pattern or order of the world. Do you remember this word, which is pronounced li, and which had as its original meaning the markings in jade, the fiber in muscle, or the grain in wood? This word then designates the basic structure within the Tao, within the fundamental field of the world, and thus its order, which can be, as it were, understood by looking at it, but is too complex, too much happening so fast altogether at once for us ever to be able to analyze it in the relatively clumsy language of words. Now thus, you see, it seems to us that that order is enormously complex. The order of nature, the order of beauty, the order of ethics, all these kinds of orders, baffle us when we try to think about them bit by bit. But actually, this order is only a complicated order when we try to think about it. I mean, it's very simple, isn't it, to drink water if you put it in a cup or a glass and toss it down. But it would be extraordinarily complex if one tried to drink water with a fork. And in the same way, the world and the order of the world, the activity within the field, seems incredibly complicated to us when we try to translate it into thinking and into words. But this then is the fundamental Chinese Taoist and Indian Buddhist view of how the formations of the world arise. Not by a step-by-step process which can be put down in a line like the instructions for making the flower, but by something which happens spontaneously altogether at once. And this particular form of activity is commonly represented in Eastern art by many-armed and many-headed figures of various divinities, such as this particular Tibetan figure of Kuan Yin. You know, Kuan Yin is sometimes known as the goddess of mercy, but actually Kuan Yin only became a goddess figure when it reached China. The original meaning of this figure is a representation of the power aspect of nature. And this wonderful Tibetan figure is graciously lent from the collection of my friend Mr. Ching-Hua Lee here in San Francisco. But the interesting thing about it is, you see, that the figure has 3 faces and 8 arms. And you might think that that presents an incredible problem of coordination. But isn't it really the same problem that we have in being alive in the simplest and most fundamental way? Our own bodies, without our thinking about it at all, are doing all kinds of things all together at once, and we don't have to stop to think about it. You remember the little rhyme, thinking of creatures with many arms, the little rhyme that says, "The centipede was happy quite, until a toad in fun said, 'Pray, which leg goes after which?' This worked its mind to such a pitch, it lay distracted in a ditch, considering how to run." And you may have noticed that the same thing can happen to us when we think too hard about how we breathe. Or if you're doing something to which you're accustomed in quite a mechanical way, like knitting or tying your necktie, when you begin to think about it too hard, you get balled up and you start dropping stitches. And so one might ask, how is it possible for Kuan Yin, this figure that we have seen, to use so many arms, to use so many faces, so many eyes? It's the same question. How can the centipede use so many legs? How can we make our bodies function, all the different parts of it going together at once without our having to think about it at all? And the answer that the Eastern world would give is that it happens because it is a field of forces. It is, in other words, a process that's going on, not governed by a boss, but a process that is self-governing. Because, you see, their idea of nature corresponds, perhaps we would say, to a democracy rather than a monarchy. In a monarchy, we have a political type of order where one mastermind is telling all the other people what to do. But we are aspiring, aren't we, in a democratic kind of political setup, to have something that is not so much like a monarchy as it is like a living organism, which is self-governing, where all the parts develop independently and yet harmoniously in terms of the pattern in a field. And so, speaking of the fundamental principle behind the world, old Lao Tzu, you remember him? I'll write his name down again, just in case you forget this rather difficult Chinese pronunciation. Lao Tzu, the founder of the Taoist philosophy, who's said to have lived about 600 BC, but probably lived much later. He said, speaking of Tao, the great Tao flows everywhere, both to the left and to the right. By it all things come into being. It loves and nourishes them, but does not lord it over them. Merits accomplished, it lays no claim to them. In other words, this is an idea of the ultimate reality, which does not govern the universe by ruling it, by telling it what to do, but by, as it were, letting it be free to organize itself harmoniously in the same way as you saw the iron filings organizing themselves within the magnetic field, in the same way as you saw the natural rose growing as distinct from the artificial daisy being made by being put together. Now then, these forms of Asian philosophy want us as individuals to feel that we participate in this great democracy of nature, no longer as isolated individuals trying to push it around or command it like monarchs or bosses. For their conception of the omnipotence of nature is not like the omnipotence of a king, but of a self-governing state. Not a mere collection of units, but a body, a self-organizing pattern. And they want us to feel that the true self of each one of us is that entire pattern. Now, in the ordinary way, we feel that although I am doing certain things, nevertheless, most of what is going on in the world is happening quite independently of me. The motions of the clouds, of the winds, the circling of the stars, the fluctuation of the tides, the flowing of rivers, all these seem to happen quite independently of the individual me. And yet, the flowing of rivers, which seem to go along by themselves, are surely neither more nor less independent of the individual me than the beating of my own heart, which, although it seems to go on independently, I mean, I don't will the beating of my heart, nevertheless, what is more fundamentally me, the very center of my physiological life? And if I don't will the beating of my heart, might it not also be possible to feel that although I do not will the motions of the winds, the tides, and the stars, that these are nevertheless just as much my activity as the coursing of the blood in my veins, moving without my having to think about it, like the centipede's legs? Might we not be able to feel that the whole eternal universe is our body, like this system here, in which every point is defined by its ties with every other point? Now then, the fundamental and final question that remains is, how are we to come to feel that way? How are we not just to think, but actually to realize, to make real to ourselves, to feel that the motions of the heavenly bodies, the rivers, the seas, the winds, are all my body. How are we to feel a general impression of life in which man is no longer the isolated, lonely, separate ego, trying desperately to defend himself by attempting to become the world's monarch, but feeling rather instead a profound kinship and fellowship and fundamentally love for the whole world, just as if it were his own body, which in this view it is. The thing which all these great Eastern philosophers insist upon, whether they be Indian or whether they be Chinese, is at first sight rather depressing to us, because the fundamental insight is that our ego and our will can do nothing to acquire this feeling of fundamental unity and solidarity. It can't do anything at all. And the feeling cannot be had until, as we say, we have given up our own will, set aside our own ego. This, after all, too, corresponds with the great basic Christian insight, where, as for example, Dante says that the will of God, in his will is our peace. Or, as another Christian writer says, our wills are ours to make them thine. In all the great religious traditions of the world, there is the recurrent theme of self-surrender, of giving up oneself. Now, at first sight, this seems something spineless. This seems something weak and namby-pamby, and as if, you know, the Marxists always say the religion is the opium of the people. And they validate their point of view by saying, look, religion always tells people to give up their will. That's so that the tyrant can push them around. The nasty capitalist can make them do what they want. But they forget that in the giving up of our own will, we do not surrender power, we gain power. Because in the giving up of our own will, we are, as it were, making ourselves an empty channel through which a greater power than our own can pass through. Lao Tzu said, you know, the usefulness of a window is not so much in the frame as in the empty space through which something can be seen. And so in the same way, you might say that the power of a human being is not so much in his particular individual identity as in a certain kind of emptiness through which something can flow. And so all the great religions of the world, and most especially those of the Asian world, have as their deepest insight the principle that man comes into his own and finds his true power in standing out of his own way, in getting out of his own light. And this involves, as I said, the surrender of our own will. But you see, always the problem is, how does the will surrender the will? There is a Chinese saying that when the wrong man uses the right means work in the wrong way. In other words, if I'm the wrong man, that is a willful, selfish, domineering person, anything I do to give up my will be motivated by my fundamental selfishness. I shall be, in other words, like a clever woman who wants to get her man, but she knows that this particular man always runs away if you go after him. So she acts as if she doesn't want him. She gives him up, apparently, but her real motive is, of course, to get him. And therefore, she is just, as it were, playing a trick. It's a kind of clever, feminine wile or deceit. And so in the same way, if we say, now, I'm going to surrender my ego, I'm going to be unselfish, I'm going to give up my will so that I can become one with God, or so that I can feel this splendid fellowship with the whole universe and feel that my identity is no longer lonely little me, but all, I shall have as the fundamental motive doing it, after all, for my own advantage. After all, because this is a new way of finding spiritual and psychological security. And so, because it is basically insincere, it won't work. And therefore, what is at first sight depressing about Eastern insights into this matter is not only that our will, when it is aggressive and assertive, stands in the way of this understanding. It also goes on to say that we cannot even surrender our wills on purpose. And that when it becomes perfectly clear to us that there is nothing at all that we can do about it, either positively by trying to achieve something or negatively by giving ourselves up, this is the fundamental deflation of our ego and its whole domineering quality. This is the limit. At this, it doesn't give itself up. It sees that it has no alternative but to give up. And from the emptiness, the silence, the feeling of impotence that follows this, the whole vision of a united world bursts like a flower from its bud. You know, it's not surprising that in this day and age, the most up-to-date and respectable form of academic philosophy taught in our universities is what is called logical analysis. A logical analyst, you know, is the kind of fellow who, the moment you say something, you hardly get a word out of your mouth before he says, "Now, just precisely what do you mean by that?" You can't take a step of the way in unfolding a proposition, a thesis, or an idea. It's perhaps just another valley like this. An old Indian aphorism says, "What is beyond is that which is also here." And you mustn't mistake this for a kind of blasé boredom. Everything is right the way it is now, however appalling, however terrible. And you know it beyond a shadow of doubt. There are two other testimony of my sincerity. Please, take me as your disciple. So Bodhidharma said, "All right, what do you want?" And Eka replied, "I have no peace of mind. Please pacify my mind." And by mind, of course, he meant his soul, his self. So Bodhidharma said, "Bring out your mind here before me. I'll pacify it." But Eka said, "When I look for my mind, I can't find it." Bodhidharma said, "There, I have pacified your mind." And at that moment, Eka had his Satori. We were talking last time about the extraordinary conflict between man and nature which exists among almost all highly civilized peoples, and especially here in the Western world, where we talk so much about our conquest of nature, our mastery of space, our subjection of the physical world. And I think one of the main reasons why we feel in this particular way is that each individual experiences himself as a peculiarly separate being. In other words, every man thinks of this world as a collection of objects. The world is a lot of things, and each person considers himself as a thing. And I wonder if you've ever stopped to ask yourself what a thing is and why you think you are a thing. Are you quite sure that you are a thing? Because if we take a look at ourselves from another point of view, for example like this, we shall find that we are not one thing at all. We're an extraordinary number of things. For what you're looking at there is the cell structure of your own body. A whole multitude of tiny, tiny little individuals. And now, we might ask again, what other points of view could we take to ourselves? We could, of course, take the sociologist's point of view, where we are not really a thing at all, but a sub-member of a group. Or still more, if a man visiting us from another planet in something like a flying saucer were to hover down and look at what sort of creature is inhabiting this earth, what would he see? Let's take a look and get some idea of his view. This is the kind of creature he would find inhabiting this planet. A sprawly, nubbly thing with various lines connecting bits of it. That would be, in his view, the kind of thing that we are. For you see, how many things we are depends upon the point of view which one takes. Every point of view that we've taken, the point of view of the cells, the point of view of the man hovering above the earth in a flying saucer or an aeroplane, is a correct point of view. And according to the way in which we look, so we divide the things of the world. For you see, it's interesting, isn't it, that the word thing is very like the word think. Because by breaking down our world into things is the way in which we think about it. We break down what we call the material world into objects and assign to those objects the kind of words we describe as nouns. And then the world of action we break into events and assign to events the kind of word we call verbs. But things and events are fundamentally the ways of breaking up our complex world so that we can think about it. I wonder if any of you have ever been to a psychologist and taken a Rorschach test and been asked to look at one of these extraordinary blots. Now, actually, the blot that we're looking at here isn't a real Rorschach blot because you're not allowed to show them in public in case people saw them before the test. But they're something like this. And they're made by splodging ink on paper and folding the paper over so that you get a symmetrical block. And the psychologist says to you when you look at that, now please will you tell me a story about it? What do you think it looks like? And you might say, well, I think it looks like a great big cat face, or maybe it's a woman's handbag, or maybe it's a dancer waving his arms in front of a pair of pine trees with some rocks around. All sorts of stories you could invent about it, anything you like. And the psychologist will use the kind of information that you've given him, the sort of things that you project out of your own mind into that blot, and he will then form some diagnosis of the kind of person you are. But you see, he's not interested in the information which you give him about the blot as a description of the blot. He's interested in what you say as a description of what is going on inside you. In other words, what you are saying about that blot is a projection of yourself into its strange and complicated conformations. Now you see, our whole world is in many ways not so very much unlike this peculiar blot. And you might think that there might be some persuasive person who stands up and gives a story about the blot of the world, and other people agree with what he says. He says, look here, that's a mountain, that's a tree, that's a rock. And everybody else would agree because he was so persuasive. And we would all be beginning to give the same story about the cosmic Rorschach blot. Because after all, our world is a very wiggly affair. Consider, for example, clouds. Or clouds with mountains across them. Or waters. Or stars. All the world is a wiggly affair. Not at all unlike that blot we were looking at. And we have to find out ways of making sense of it. Perhaps one of the things that men first, one of those strangest and most difficult to understand things that men first began to make sense of in this kind of Rorschach blot interpretation way were the stars in heaven. And one of the ways in which they did this was to project upon the skies figures of all kinds of mythological monsters and beasts, such as the idea of a dipper for the Great Bear, those stars in the Great Bear that look, you know, like a ladle, or some people call them the plow. Or here, perhaps on a celestial sphere of this kind, you can see quite clearly the outline of the constellation Leo, the lion. A lion drawn in the sky, so that men could find their way about in the stars, recognize their outlines by associating certain groups of stars with familiar images. But you see, this is fundamentally a projection of ideas out of our own minds onto nature. Nature itself will take all kinds of different projections, and no one is necessarily the right one. They work for us so long as we agree about them. That is, so long as we abide by convention. And in Indian philosophy, the fundamental word for this kind of thing is the Sanskrit term Maya. I'm going to write that down for you. Pronounced Maya. And this word comes from a root in the Sanskrit language, Ma. And the word Ma is at the basis of all kinds of words that we use in our own tongue. It's at the basis of matter, of the Latin mater or mother, at the basis of matrix or metric, because the fundamental meaning of the root ma is to measure. And so it works in this sort of way. I was talking about our world being wiggly. You know, something like this. That is the typical sort of shape that we're having to deal with all the time. And I think you'll see at once that a shape like that is extraordinarily difficult to talk about. If I were talking on the radio at the moment and not on television, I would have the greatest difficulty in describing that line to you in such a way that you could write it down on a piece of paper in front of you without seeing it. But here you can see it, and you can understand it at once. But it isn't enough just to be able to see things. We want to be able to talk about them. We want to be able to describe them exactly so that we can control them and deal with them. I mean, supposing this were the outline of a piece of territory on a map, then you might want to tell someone an exact spot to which he should go. And then you would have to be far more precise about it than you can be when you just get the general idea of it by looking at it. And so we introduce then the idea of Maya by essentially doing this. This might be called a matrix. A line crossed, lines crossed by lines in a very formal, simple pattern. And the moment we do that, it becomes very easy indeed to talk about this wiggly line, because we could, for example, number all these squares across 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on. We can also number them downwards. And then in terms of numbers across and numbers down, we can indicate the exact points on this grid which cross the wiggly line. And by numbering those points one after another, we can give an accurate description of the way that line moves. And furthermore, supposing the line under our grid were not still like this one, but supposing it was wiggling in motion, supposing it was a flea or something dipped in ink who was crawling across the paper, and we wanted to know where he was going to go, all we would have to do would be to plot out the positions which he has covered, and then we could calculate statistically a trend which would indicate where he would be likely to go next. And if he went there next, we should say, by Jove, isn't that incredible? This little flea crawling across the paper is obeying the laws of statistics. Well, as a matter of fact, he isn't. What he is doing is, or rather I should say, not what he is doing, but what we are doing, is we are making a very, very abstract model of the way in which that line is shaped or in which that flea is crawling. We are breaking it up into little bits, whereas in fact it is not a lot of little bits. It is a continuous sweep. But by treating it in this way, as if it were broken up into bits, we are measuring it, we are making a maya, and these cross lines are a maya just in the same way as the idea of the lion, the Leo constellation in the stars is a maya, a way of projecting. You see, this thing, it comes out of our minds, and we project it upon nature like this, and break nature into bits so that it can be easily talked about and handled. But you see, this tends to give us the impression that our world is a lot of bits, and that things are really separate from each other. You see, how could I demonstrate how this is? I have an idea. Mr. Cameraman, will you focus the camera on one small tiny spot in the set and come very close to it and travel along bit by bit by bit by bit. Now you see, this is looking at the world little bit by little bit, as if we were only using the central vision of our eyes, the kind of vision we use for reading and close work of that kind. But if this were the only way we had of looking at things, it would be very difficult to make any sense of life at all, because we would see everything in series, bit after bit after bit. But fortunately, we are also able to enlarge the whole view and take in everything at once in a single sweep. And you see, this shows all the advantages and the disadvantages of looking at things in the way that Indian philosophy calls maya. Because if maya were the only way we had for looking at things, we should only be able to understand one thing at a time. And our world is not just one thing happening, one after another, one at a time. Our world is an enormous volume, a great vastness in which everything is happening all together at once. Now, being able to think of things one at a time is extraordinarily useful, because this is what enables us to have science, to have scientific control of nature, to be able to count things, measure them, manage them, and predict their behavior in the future. But it is inclined to run away with us and give us the impression, if we think too hard about things, or if we put too much faith in thinking, that the world is made up of a lot of separate bits, so that we have a kind of bit-by-bit approach to nature, what I might call a putt-putt-putt-putt view of life. It's useful, indeed, to break things down into things and to classify them. But the moment it gives us the impression that these little bits into which we have divided the world are really and in nature separate from each other, we get into confusion. Now, how do we know that divided things aren't really separate? Look, for example, at me. How do you know I'm here? How can you make out the outlines of my body? Isn't it because there is a contrast between the background behind me and my figure? You know where the background ends and I begin, and so you are able to see me. But now what would happen if the background should vanish and disappear? And I would no longer be there, but the figure in the ground instead would be my button. In order to see me, you have to see a background along with me. And so, if we go back and look again at the whole thing, then we can see once again. Now, what does that tell us? Surely, the thing that it tells us is not merely that the background is one thing and the figure is another. Since the two must go together, it indicates that there is a connection between them. If you can't have the perception of a figure without a background, if you simply cannot see it if there is no background there, doesn't that mean that the background and the figure are some way inseparable? They're different, yes, but they're inseparable differences. Take, for example, a coin. When you have a coin, it has two sides, heads and tails. And these two sides are indeed different. You might say they are separate sides. But what would happen if we take a file and start rubbing away to get rid of one of the sides? Well, we would rub and rub and rub, and when we finally got rid of the side, the other side would have vanished too, because the two sides of a coin go together. Yes, they are different, but they are also inseparable. And this is true of almost everything in the world, because we distinguish things from their background. We distinguish one side from another as we distinguish up from down. Now imagine what would happen if we arranged everything in this set, or tried to arrange everything, so that nothing were down, everything had to be up. If we could really, in nature, separate the up from the down, why, we couldn't do it. Because up goes with down, is unintelligible apart from down, in the same way that the head side of a coin goes together with the tail side. And so in this way, we as individuals, as separate beings, are really inseparable from the whole natural environment in which we live. We go together, and you cannot have the one without the other. Without what we call things, there would be no world. But without what we would call the whole world, there would be no things. And this is not only true of what we call things and objects. It's also true of many of our experiences. Let's take, for example, one of the most fundamental distinctions in experience: what is pleasant and what is not. Now, a great many people are bending the whole effort of their lives to have pleasure and get rid of pain. This pursuit of pleasure is regarded as the fundamental aim of human existence. And you know, when you start to read old books on Indian philosophy, Chinese philosophy, they very often say that the first thing a man must understand is to give up the pursuit of pleasure. And people who read these things think that these are very gripey Puritans, people who have a sour attitude to life, who burnt their fingers in the game of the pursuit of pleasure, and say, well, let's not get mixed up with that anymore. But as a matter of fact, this is just a plain, clear, sensible statement. It's like saying, you cannot have up without down. You cannot have a figure without a background. And in the same way exactly, you cannot experience pleasure unless there is something with which you can contrast it. You know what happens when a person who's longed to make a great deal of money all his life, and he makes it. Finally he gets $1 million. And he thinks this is the answer. Well, it's fine, just in the moment of transition, while he is going from poverty to richness. But when he's had his $1 million for a few months, everything adjusts itself. and he begins to feel just the same as he always felt before. Conversely, if some of you have lived near a tannery or near a public utility place like a gas-producing factory, you get so used to the bad smell in the background that you cease to notice it. It becomes the normal smell, and so you don't notice it anymore as a bad smell. For both the bad and the good need each other as contrasts. And therefore, when we try to get rid of one of the pairs and possess the other only, we do something that is profoundly nonsensical. We think we can do it because in Maya, that is to say, in conventional thinking, in terms of that kind of measurement that we call thought, we can separate the one from the other. We can talk about up as different from down. We can talk about one thing as different from other things. But in actual experience, it can't be done. Just as in actual experience, that wiggly line was a continuous line and not a series of points. And in another way, too, we can't really pursue pleasure, because pleasure is something that has to come to us. For example, you can pursue a cow, and you can go out and catch it and kill it and serve it up as steak. That you can do. But you can't pursue the pleasure that you get from eating steak. If, in other words, you try to get pleasure out of steak, supposing I sit here and I have a great big splendid steak served to me, and I say, this is the best steak I ever ate, why, it's a Chateaubriand, and it costs $12 a plate, and therefore I must make the very maximum effort to enjoy it, and I cut the thing up, and I put it in my mouth, and say, now, I've really got to get the most out of this piece of steak. And so I chew it with all my might to get the very best out of it. And what happens? I'm making so much muscular strain, I'm trying so hard to get something out of it, that I frustrate the very pleasure that it should give. Why is that? Surely it is because pleasure is a function of nerves, and you can't make an effort with your nerves. Catching a cow is a function of muscles, and you can make an effort with your muscles. To give another illustration of the same thing, supposing I want to see an object in the far distance. I want to make out the time on a distant clock. Now my eyes are nervous rather than muscular. And if I strain my eyes very hard to make out what is way off on the clock in the distance, what happens? All the images of the figures on the clock go fuzzy. But if I relax my eyes and let the image come to it, as light does in fact come to the eyes, then I can see the image clearly. So, when we think of the world as consisting primarily of a lot of disconnected things, and ourselves as one of them, so that we go out and get those things, or we can push those things around to suit ourselves, we forget so easily that the entire system of nature, ourselves included, is interconnected in every conceivable way. You know what happens when you think, well, we've got a lot of mosquitoes around here, all kinds of insects that bite us and bother us. Let's get rid of them. So we bring in the DDT and we send an aeroplane over and spray the whole surrounding territory with DDT. And what happens? Suddenly we find that other insects or other pests which those insects we destroyed were feeding upon multiply and increase. And we have a new problem. We have to get rid of those. It's like when they brought rabbits into Australia because they thought they'd be useful there for some reason or other. The rabbits multiplied because there was nothing that fed on rabbits. Then they had a plague of rabbits. You see, you cannot just push nature around. You cannot regard it as something to be attacked so that you can grab bits from it and shove it around any old way as if it were a machine that you could bang around like a mechanic. indeed even machines, as any good mechanic knows, are not that simple to play with. But if we do not see that our view of the separateness of the world is based on a convention of thinking, it exists as it were in here. It doesn't exist out here in actual concrete reality. And if we are confused, then we jump to follow our thoughts instead of our senses, and this is no sense. I suppose most of you are familiar with this old optical illusion. And you're asked the question, which of the three thick black lines is the longer? And I suppose one's natural reaction is to say the one on the left. And I think you know that this is a result of the illusion of perspective. An illusion with which we are so used, to which we're so used, and by which we're so easily fooled once we've accustomed ourselves to it. You might, if that picture were drawn more vividly, even be predisposed to thinking that was a real passage stretching away from you with doors at the end. Of course, if you came up against that kind of thing painted against the wall, you might make the mistake of walking into it and banging your nose. But this is an example of what we were talking about last time as Maya, that word from Indian philosophy which generally has the meaning of illusion, or rather illusions brought about by the acceptance of certain conventions of which perspective was an example. When we are not aware that certain things which we take for granted, like the separateness of things from each other, when we're not aware that this is a matter of convention, we are apt to be fooled. Now, I think one of the conventions by which we tend to be fooled more than almost any other is time. And for all human beings, time is a matter of extraordinary importance. And perhaps this is one of the principal ways in which we differ from animals. Because man has been called a time-binding animal. That is to say, a creature who is vividly aware of the fact that his life moves, as it were, along a line from the past through the present and into the future. Animals apparently live pretty much moment by moment. They don't appear to have very strong memories. But because man has a strong memory, he is able to bear the past in mind and, as it were, cast it forward into visions of the future based upon what has happened in the past. And therefore, although this facility gives man the most extraordinary ability to plan his life, to prepare for future eventualities, at the same time, there is a very heavy price which he pays for it, and especially if he takes this ability too seriously. In other words, if he doesn't realize that the true reality in which he lives is the present moment now. For example, the animal probably doesn't concern itself very much with problems of future disease, death, or starvation, and things of that kind. If an animal sees another dead animal lying around, I don't suppose he thinks to himself, well, one day that's going to happen to me. Rather, he just sees a dead animal, sniffs it, sees whether it's good to eat, and wanders away. But for human beings, it's entirely different. Because we actually spend most of our time and a great deal of our emotional energy living in time which is not here, living in an elsewhere which is not concretely real. So much so that although we may be quite comfortable and happy in our present circumstances, if there is not a guarantee, not a promise, of a good time coming tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, we are at once unhappy, even in the midst of pleasure and affluence. And so we develop a kind of chronic anxiety about time. we want to be sure more and more, because of our sensitivity to the feeling of time, we want to be sure more and more that our future is assured. And for this reason, the future becomes of more importance to most human beings than the present. And in this sense, we are hooked, taken in by a Maya, because it is of very little use to us to be able to control and plan the future unless we are capable at the same time of living totally in the present. And so, when in civilized societies we spend so much of our time living for the future, we become very much like those celebrated donkeys, you know, that have a carrot fastened on a stick that's tied to the neck, you know, behind here, and it comes over, and there's the carrot dangling in front of them. And they pursue it, but can never reach it. And so in exactly the same way, it's that way with us. My goodness, don't you remember when you went first to school? You went to kindergarten. And in kindergarten, the idea was to push along so that you could get into first grade, and then push along so that you could get into second grade, third grade, and so on, going up and up. And then you went to high school, and this was a great transition in life. And now the pressure is being put on. You must get ahead. You must go up the grades and finally be good enough to get to college. And then when you get to college, you're still going step by step, up to the great moment in which you're ready to go out into the world. And then when you get out into this famous world comes the struggle for success in profession or business. And again, there seems to be a ladder before you, something for which you're reaching all the time. And then, suddenly, when you're about 40 or 45 years old in the middle of life, you wake up one day and say, huh? I've arrived. And by Jove, I feel pretty much the same as I've always felt. In fact, I'm not so sure that I don't feel a little bit cheated. Because you see, you were fooled. You were always living for somewhere where you aren't. And while, as I said, it is of tremendous use for us to be able to look ahead in this way and to plan, there is no use planning for a future, which when you get to it and it becomes a present, you won't be there. You'll be living in some other future which hasn't yet arrived. And so in this way, one is never able actually to inherit and enjoy the fruits of one's action. You can't live at all unless you can live fully now. And because now is never satisfactory, because we're never really living in it, we get more and more avid to go ahead and pursue the future. We develop our technology to a fantastic ability where we can more and more fulfill our desires for the future almost immediately, working towards a sort of push-button world. But have you ever stopped to think what the world would be like if you could fulfill every wish the moment you wished it? Suppose, for example, on going to bed at night, you could always dream whatever you wanted to dream. What would happen after a while? Of course, I suppose at first, you would dream fantastic pleasures, wonderful adventures, fulfillment of all the things you ever wished. Then as time went on, don't you think you'd want to be, a little bit surprised, to have a little bit less control over what was happening to you? And after you'd experimented with this for some months or years, you might even want dreams in which you suffer. Because there is no real delight, no real fulfillment without delay. Doesn't every child know on a hot day when you think, I'm terribly thirsty and I'd like an ice cream soda? Haven't you tried the experiment of putting off drinking it, putting off, so that you get thirstier and thirstier, and it's so much fun when you finally get to it? And so in the same way, impatience with time, always wanting the future, is frustrating. Now you know, in Indian thought, one of the basic myths or ideas is of Brahma, the world creator, who has infinite power and has everything that he wants. But he is like our dreamer. And he wants to do something with the infinite time at his disposal. And therefore what he does is to dream just like this. To dream the existence of the world. And he does it over enormous and incalculable periods of time. Dreaming that he is the knower, the self, in every single creature that exists in the world. Dreaming them all at once, experiencing their joys and sorrows, completely plunging himself into the adventure of forgetting who he is. But he does this for immense and vast periods, rivaling in conception the latest modern astronomical ideas of the extent of time. You know, the basic reckoning period of time in the life of Brahma, the creator, is called a kalpa. And that is a period of 4,320,000 years. And the kalpas are called the days of Brahma. One day for Brahma's life is a kalpa. And so there are the periods which you can call his days or nights, whichever you wish, where he goes into dream and he dreams the world. Then for the following kalpa he wakes up and realizes who he is again, and then he dreams again, going on and on and on through years of kalpas, of 360 days and nights of Brahma, centuries of kalpas, endlessly, endlessly, endlessly. For the Hindu doesn't think of time in quite the same way that we do. Obviously, we think of time as linear, day after day after day after day, going along in a line. Or sometimes we like to think of time as this sort of line, going up and up and up and up and up and up and getting better and better and better. But that's not the fundamental idea of time for almost any people in the world outside of Western civilization. In nearly every other part of the world, time is thought of as a circle. And they say, after all, isn't it reasonable for it to be a circle? Look at your watch. Doesn't your watch go round and round? But the Hindus not only think of time as cycling, going round and round and round forever, just as the earth cycles round and around the sun. They also think of it in another quite fundamentally different way from our conception of time. I referred to this idea that's common among us, that time is going up and up and things are getting better and better. But in the general Hindu view, in every cycle of time, things tend on the whole to get worse and worse. They divide the kalpa into a number of shorter periods, each of which is called a yuga. But the yugas are so arranged that there are 4 of them in what is called a Mahayuga or Great Yuga. The first one, occupying this period, is the longest. The second one occupies a shorter period, from here to here. The third, still shorter than the second. The fourth, the shortest of all. And the names that are given to them are the names of the throws in the Indian game of dice. The best throw, the throw of 4, is called Krita. And that lasts for the longest time. It is a golden age where everything is just fine. The next one is called Treta, the throw of 3. Pretty good, but not quite so good. The third is called Dvapara, the throw of 2. And here, good and evil are equally balanced. Not so hot. The final throw, the throw of 1, is called Kali, the worst throw, and that's the shortest period. And of course, according to Hindu ideas, we're living in it now. But in Kali Yuga, everything goes to pieces and becomes dreadful. And time goes faster. Now, why do they feel that time deteriorates in this way? It is because as one lives in time and becomes more and more conscious of time, we tend more and more to pursue the future, as I said a little while ago. And as we pursue the future, present time becomes more and more unsatisfactory, and we feel that we have to chase our happiness at greater and greater speeds. I was talking the other day to a college president who said, you know, I'm so busy now that I'm going to have to get a helicopter. I said, whatever you do, don't do it, because if you get it, more will be expected of you. You'll be expected to go to more places faster. And you see, in this whole problem of speed, of getting advantages in life because we can move about rapidly, we forget that speed is only of real advantage to you if you're the only person who has it. Then you can get ahead of other people. But the minute everybody else catches up with you, you're all back where you were, only going much faster and much more nervously. Going, as it were, faster and faster to less and less desirable objectives. We hurry everything we do. We make our products, our houses, our furniture, our clothes, so that they become obsolete quickly. We're in such a hurry to get everything done. We pay attention to the front rather than the back. Who, for example, in this day and age, has time to do anything like this? Here's a piece of Chinese embroidery. Those among you who've ever done any embroidery, some of the ladies, will no doubt recognize that this is a kind of stitch called needlepoint. It's done on a material made up of minute little squares of thread, like a grid or lattice of thread. And this work here is so minute that there are 1,024 stitches to the square inch. So well done, furthermore, that if you turn it over and look at the back is almost as neat as the front. You know, ordinarily when you embroider, you take shortcuts around the back and take threads, jumping spaces and tying knots and things of that kind. But here, no hurry. Or take such an ordinary object as a lady's pocketbook. This again is Chinese embroidery work in shaded silk, very patiently done over a padded base underneath so that the figures stand out. And inside it, a little sewing case, which opens up, showing concealed within the place for the scissors, but the most delicate work. But in this day and age, we don't have time for it. Because we are always in a hurry to get things finished. And so the things that we finish weren't worth finishing because they were done so fast. After all, the enjoyment of our world is not really unlike listening to music. We don't play music in order to get somewhere. I mean, if the objective of music were to arrive at a point, say the last bar, the final great crashing chords of the symphony, well then all we'd do would be just hurry up its playing, play it as fast as possible so as to get to the culmination, the end, as soon as possible. Or just cut out the whole symphony and play only the last bars. To be able to enjoy it, we have got to live each moment of the playing and listen to it as if it were the only thing important to listen to. And then if we do that, our time has an entirely different quality. It's represented in a Buddhist saying that spring does not become the summer. There is spring and then there is summer. Firewood does not turn into ashes. There is first firewood, and then there are ashes. The two stages being, as it were, sufficient by themselves. And this is intended to give the idea of living in a fully concrete present into which you settle in. I mean, the present for most of us is, isn't it, just a hairline on a dial. And the hand goes by it flash, and there's nothing in it, one after another. But here there is an entirely different sense of the present, as something you can settle into. There's a line behind me from a Chinese poet, and it says, literally, day, ditto, in other words, day, day, that is good day. Every day is a good day. And it comes as the last line of this poem. In spring, hundreds of flowers. In summer, refreshing breeze. In autumn, the moon. Free your mind from idle thoughts, and for you, every season is a good season, or every day is a good day. And idle thoughts mean illusory thoughts. Thoughts of pursuing a future. Thoughts of making one's happiness depend on something which isn't here at all. But when one can come to realize that the present is the only place in which you live, and that the past and the future are now no more than useful illusions, still useful, but useful only if one can live in the present, then, as I say, one can settle into full participation with the momentary reality of life as it goes along, just like music. And so in the arts of the Far East, there is reflected a kind of delight in momentariness. One can really consider, for example, this stem of a broken bamboo. Or not only in painting, but in poetry. A poem in the Japanese haiku style. Poems which just crystallize a single moment. In the dark forest, a berry drops. The sound of the water. Or a painting of a man sitting all alone in his boat, listening to the water. He's not asleep. He's not dreaming. He's a man living in an entirely real world. A world which we neglect because we have no time to sit and listen to the water. After all, are not the memories which you go over memories which persuade you that it's really worth being alive? Really memories of certain moments in which life itself brought you completely awake. I know we all think of things like the smell of coffee and bacon cooking on an autumn morning, the smell of burning leaves. I remember particularly for me one glimpse of a flock of sunlit pigeons against the dark background of a thundercloud. And it's incidents like that that are very largely celebrated in Far Eastern art and poetry. Perceptions of the full reality and intensity of the moment. Such a one as this. The sea darkens. The voices of the wild ducks are faintly white. A brushwood gate, and for a lock, this snail. or paintings where one sees just a few birds on a branch, so vividly alive that you somehow think the next time you look at the branch, the birds won't be there. This is all an art form, possible for people who feel themselves to be living in this real momentary world. I remember once a very wise man who used to give lectures on philosophical matters of this kind. Before he started giving any lecture, would sit for a while looking at his audience very intently like this. And then quite suddenly he would say, "Wake up! You're all fast asleep. And if you don't wake up, I won't give any lecture." And another Chinese sage pointed one day to some flowers while talking to a friend and said, "Most people look at these as if they were in a dream." And Buddha, one of the wisest of the sons of Asia, his real name was Gautama, but he was called Buddha because Buddha means the awakened one, the man who woke up. Now, in what sense was he awake? He was awake in the sense that he was completely all here. After all, we say about a person who's nuts, he's not all here. He's not all there. But our whole culture, our whole civilization, insofar as it is involved with time and living only for a future, is nuts. It's not all here. We are not awake. We are not completely alive now. And consequently, we are so hungry and so greedy because everything seems tasteless. We are living for an abstraction which has not yet come to be, and we don't know what really is.